Actually, I would be careful about putting this on the website because it's an ongoing investigation. I mean, I'm not telling you anything that's not in the public domain. So, can you see my slides?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, the PowerPoint, right? Okay. So thank you, everybody. Sorry about this. I'll speed it up. The agenda today will be talking about medical device recalls, and I'll go over the regulation, the recall types, software recalls, a case study, and then the final takeaway and tips. And like Mary said, anyone that has any questions, please feel free to stop me and I'll answer. So we have the FDA that this is our livelihood. We deal with them. They're our customer. And the FDA came about in 1906, okay? And they came about as a result of a expose that was written. It's called The Jungle, and it described the horrible meat packing conditions in Chicago at the time and how basically the American public was being poisoned with some pretty nasty stuff. And the people that came to America at the time, they were exploited. And so the person that wrote the book, The Jungle, wanted to appeal to better social conditions. And basically, what resulted was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, because people became aware of how their food contained less than savory things in it. And so the FDA Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that we use today was established in 1906 by Theodore Roosevelt. And the fundamentals to the act is a law. But basically, when people get in trouble with the FDA, it's pretty simple as far as what you can get in trouble for. You can get in trouble for it's called misbranding, adulteration, obstruction of justice, making a false statement, wire fraud, conspiracy, and then I'll go into the POC doctrine. But what misbranding is, it's a misdemeanor, okay? And for example, if you put your product on the market without a 510K, that's misbranding. You'd think it would be higher, a felony, but it isn't. Now, the related crimes related to that misdemeanor could be a felony, but that's the legal concept. And misbranding goes under labeling. In other words, the claims you make, and this was beginning with food in the beginning. Eventually, we'll get to drugs. Adulteration is an old-fashioned term, okay? But what that means is that the product isn't made to what it's supposed to be made to. So at the time when The Jungle was written, the only word to describe the food was it was adulterated. And so that legal term carries on to today. So, for example, if you don't make your product according to a procedure and you release it, it's considered to be adulterated, even though you might say, well, adulteration only pertains to food and physical things, but that's the law that's been in effect since 1906. Now, the ways in which you get in trouble, okay, those are the two legal concepts. The adulteration of a food, drug, or medical device is a felony, and misbranding, once again, is a misdemeanor. But when the FDA conducts an investigation, okay, obstruction of justice can occur. And people don't intend for this to happen. But if you in any way mislead the FDA or send them down a false trail when there's an investigation, that's considered to be obstruction of justice. And then anytime you make a false statement to the FDA, that's also a crime. And then the other crime is wire fraud. So wire fraud used to be just through the mail, okay, before the internet, now, or the telephone. Now it involves everything electronically. And so if you make a false statement through the internet, that's considered to be a false statement and wire fraud in addition, because you're crossing state lines. And then lastly, there's conspiracy. And so usually what happens when a crime occurs, okay, is that other people are involved. It could be your boss, it could be a fellow worker or whatever. And once two or more people are aware of an issue and let's say they try to cover it up, then conspiracy comes in to the possible crimes. And then there's the POC doctrine, okay? And this was a Supreme Court decision that was made in 1975. And the Supreme Court established that an executive of a company can't claim I didn't know. Okay. In other words, if you're a corporate entity in the company, like a CEO, someone with fiduciary responsibilities, what this doctrine says is that you're liable. You're liable for your employees. And that's very important with the FDA and the law. So once again, the FDA, it's Food and Drug Administration, but the law is the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. Okay. So next slide. So the FDA and medical devices. So Jim will probably appreciate this, okay? 1976 was not too long ago. So believe it or not, before 1976, the FDA had no legal authority to regulate drugs, okay? And that's, we had put a person on the moon several years earlier, so it's pretty crazy to think that medical devices weren't regulated. And during the 70s, that's when there was a social awareness. That's where the EPA was established, the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, and other regulatory bodies. And so with medical devices, in the early 70s, a study was done, and in that study, they believed that over 10,000 Americans would lose their lives each year because of defective medical devices, okay? And the reason I have Hawaii 5-0 over here, okay, this is from 1968. This is the first season. And anybody that wants to learn medical devices, there's a two-part series, okay? And in the corner is a person operating a medical device in a courtroom. And basically, they were floating the idea of why medical devices needed to be regulated in popular culture. And when you watch this episode, it's kind of corny, but I'm telling you, you watch it and it'll tell you why the FDA is involved with regulating medical devices. Let's see a second. So for this presentation, what I want to describe to you, and this is my own definition, okay? There's three levels of the FDA in terms of enforcement, basically, okay? So there's level one, and that's who we deal with. That's the FDA headquarters, which is located in Maryland. And this is where headquarters is located, upper management. And when we send our 510Ks, okay, now it's electronically, this is where they are reviewed. And prior to the pandemic, they would be in this building. Now the FDA has a pretty liberal remote policy, and this is why sometimes we'll receive additional information letters at like 9 o'clock at night. Is because they have a flexible work schedule. So the people that we deal with the FDA are scientific reviewers, and even though the FDA is a law enforcement agency, the people once again that we're dealing with are very smart people like us, okay, and they're trying to do a good job and just they want it. Their mission is to make sure that the devices are safe and effective. So their customer is the public, okay, and we're the public. So then there's level two, okay. So if you've worked in the industry, okay, where I've worked many years actually in locations that are registered with the FDA has a legal authority to be able to enter your building, okay? You cannot deny them, and to inspect the medical device facilities. So when the law was created in 1976, there weren't many software controlled devices. So most of the law pertains to physical devices, and it's worded in that fashion. But for the sake of what we do, when the FDA comes and let's say it's a registered office, okay, and they're producing a software controlled device, that is what they'll inspect. So yeah, they're not going to check whether or not you have a rodent control procedure, okay, which they would if you have a medical device company, but they will review the design history file. And what you're looking at is an actual FDA badge, and they carry that. They're called investigators. A lot of times people call them inspectors, but inspection is what the FDA does when they come to a medical device facility, and the way they record their observation is on an inspection report form. And when I first started my career and I went to a seminar that was given by a former FDA investigator, now turned consultant, he said, think of it this way. So when the FDA comes to inspect you, they're not there to tell you, wow, you have a great company, good job. They're there to gather evidence to indict you, okay? Now, they don't start off like that, but this is what you have to remind yourself, that compliance is not an option. It's the law. And if you're out of compliance, and if the degree of out of compliance created a safety risk, it could cause problems down the road. And if during an inspection, let's say you lie or mislead the investigator so that you don't get a warning letter or lose your job or whatever, you could possibly get in trouble with what I had said before. Now, the FDA, they understand that, we're all humans, and we make mistakes. And whenever they judge a situation, they're looking for willful intent, okay? And so, once again, they carry badges, they're investigators. Most of the time, they're not problems. Usually when you look at when people get in trouble, which we'll go into in a little while, it's because something big has happened. So then there's level 3, and that's the special agents. Okay, so the FDA created this section in the early 90s, and it had to do with, the chance of violence, because, they're not only dealing with devices, they're dealing with foods, drugs, and so if people are doing something criminally nefarious, it could get dangerous. And so the FDA has special agents. And if you look at the LinkedIn profile of some of these special agents, or some of them don't have it, but I just know from personal experience, is that they're former FBI agents, IRS agents. They could be even part of the TSA, but they're involved in law enforcement. So when they're called in, they're given a lot of power, and they actually wear firearms. Okay, and so if you're ever involved with something like that, it's a pretty serious issue. So I asked you before joining this meeting to visit the FDA website for recalls, and then put in the term software related, okay? And if you notice, just this year, there's been 146 software recalls, okay? Now, some of them are repetitious, because when you have a recall situation, it can get pretty extensive. In other words, a company may have a recall on one product, and then they'll discover that they have the same product, same issue on a related product, and this will cause, like the domino effect. But you can learn a lot from this website, okay, because you can get a sense of what companies report as problems and what companies don't report as problems. So, for example, when I worked for Johnson & Johnson, because we're a Fortune 50 company, basically anytime somebody reported an issue, let's say with the implant, they would submit a medical device safety report, okay? And their conclusion was it wasn't our fault, it had to do with this or that. And so if you visit the More database and you Google, let's say Johnson & Johnson, you might see 1,000 medical device reports, and you'd say, oh, they're making a bad product, and it's not that. They tend to over-report, and the same thing can happen here with recalls in the different sense, where companies can under-report. So you might visit this website, and you'll see, what a company like Philips, that's involved in one of the largest recalls as we speak, for a kind of a non-software controlled product, the CPAP machine, but it got pretty serious. So they tend to report more issues because they're under, the eyes of the FDA right now, where some companies, they may not report an issue. And so this is what you can glean from that. So there's 3 levels of recalls. There's class 1, class 2, and class 3. And unlike medical devices, okay, where class one is pretty safe, well understood devices. A class one recall is the types of recalls that'll be on CNN or, national news. Say, don't eat this, these cantaloupes are bad, or right now it's cucumbers. And same thing with medical devices. Like if you have a CPAP machine made by Philips, stop using it now. You may inhale and choke to death on the plastic. So a class one recall means a death has occurred or it could occur. And there's guidelines, well, not guidelines, there's regulations of how that recall has to be communicated to the public. Class two recalls are the majority recalls, and those are the ones where the FDA will say there's a reasonable chance of a safety issue happening. So most recalls, when you reach that level, you may think it's minor. The FDA will always consider, extrapolate it to be the highest, this could be a safety issue, okay? And so these are the majority of recalls at class two, so they're serious. And like, medical devices, class two devices comprise the majority of, medical device clearances. And then there's finally class three. And class three is a seldom used recall, but that's if you make a minor mistake. In other words, if you printed, if you had a spelling error in your labeling or something that, it's not going to be a safety issue, but it's going to force you to do a recall to recover the product. Okay. Because once a product is outside of your jurisdiction, okay, to get it back, it's a recall. Companies will use a rationale called you can do a market withdrawal or whatever. That means if your physical product is in the warehouse and you discover a problem that hasn't been released to the public, then you might not have to let the FDA know because you're still in control. Okay. And that's how some companies will avoid having a recall. The gray area occurs with software because, as we know, software is distributed through, the internet, the cloud. And if we discover a problem, we can correct it pretty quickly. But if you follow the letter of the law, okay, that could be interpreted as a recall. Now, the good thing is that we don't own the software that we're producing, I don't think in most cases. So it's up to the company that's the manufacturer who's distributing the product to make this decision. But when you have a problem, you have to tell the FDA. And the FDA is going to find out sooner or later. And I just know that from personal experience on other things, which I probably could tell you these stories when we go down to Texas. But right now, I'll just keep silent on that. So having a recall is not a crime. It's a remedy. The law is closed loop. And so it's a formal way of removing or correcting a problem. It protects the public, and there's a follow-up and closure to it. So if you've ever been involved in a physical recall, sometimes they can last a while because, it could be a function of the expiration date of the product. You have to have an effectiveness check on the recall. So in other words, they allow you to say, we've recovered 75% of the product and we can't find the others, and therefore we think it should be closed. And the FDA will say, fine. They have a recall coordinator in each district in the United States, and they'll come in on the follow-up and conduct an investigation, possibly if they find evidence to that effect. And that's usually where the crime may occur or be revealed. It's when you have the closure or the follow-up to the recall. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the case study. So right now, up in Massachusetts, this is actually occurring. Okay, and basically there was a company that in the around 2007, they received FDA 510(k) clearance for a device. Oh, okay. Before I tell you that, so we're going to talk about the device, which is lead tested. So why did I select this? First of all, it's a software controlled medical device. There was a 510K submission involved. There was an FDA request for additional information. There was a letter to file. The company was in the biggest deal ever. There was a consultant, and then there were recalls. So I leave you with, then there were the alleged crimes, which I say were committed by good people. Okay, people that, thought of themselves as good, as ethical, probably could never imagine themselves being in the situation. And so the story. So what you're looking at right now is a software controlled device that was cleared. The the one on the left, that was cleared around 2007. And the company, which is located in Massachusetts, this is all on the internet, they had the patent to this technology, and I think they virtually had a monopoly due to the patent and 510K clearance. But the product was cleared in 2007, okay? And the company was very successful selling the product, and the company's growing. And then, as things manifest themselves in business, there was the product on the right, which is called the Ultra. And this is the new and improved version. Okay. And so when they do these lead tests, they want to do them quickly. They want to, I think the turnaround time is like a day or so. And so to test for lead is very important, because if you have lead poisoning, that's not a good thing. And you may have lead poison, you may not even realize it. So once again, they built up a really big market. They were very, very successful, and they developed the Lead Care Ultra. So in 2013, they submitted a 510K. And just like how we know from our experience, like just because you have a 510K and you want to submit another one for almost the same type of product, doesn't mean that, it's going to fly through. There's different reviewers. The FDA is always changing. I usually tell people that the FDA of 2025, you'll be saying in 2030 was easy. Okay. It never gets easier, is what I'm trying to say. Back in 2007, which, that was in the peak of my career, we were saying, oh, the FDA is ridiculous to hard. And so my point is in 2013, when they submitted this 510K for the new improved Ultra device, which had certain features, the FDA reviewer had questions, a pretty typical question, which resulted in like an AI letter, additional information letter, and required them to perform follow-up testing. So it's during this testing that they discovered an issue, and basically it was that their tests weren't repeatable, and with this particular model, it had a propensity to give low test results on lead, false. In other words, saying, oh, your lead level is this, and it was really higher. Okay. And so they were somehow able to satisfy the FDA, okay, and provide results. But basically, the testing was conducted under ideal conditions. So they received a 510K clearance. Okay. So after they released a new and improved model, complaints started coming in because the issue they had was noticeable. Okay. And what I mean by that is that when they were doing the investigation on the Leadcast Ultra, they kind of discovered that the Lead Care 2, which was their bread and butter product, had been around, for like 7 years or whatever, kind of had the same problems. Okay. And so the complaints started coming in. They had to reply to the complaints, and the complaints started coming in for the Lead Care Ultra at a higher rate. And I guess they hired a consultant. Okay. And so, what do we do? What do we do? And they didn't want to report it to the FDA. And the consultant basically gave an ultimatum and said, if you don't report it, I will. Okay, because now the consultant's involved, okay, on site. And so it forced them to do what they were supposed to do, which was report the problems to the FDA. So you report it through, it's called a medical device report, or MAUD. And so this is a common thing with the FDA. They receive these things all the time. So a less sophisticated company might think if I submit a report, that means the FDA is going to be, knocking on my door, tomorrow. And that's not the case. If anything, the FDA could take them a while. It's on record that you've submitted this report. And if you're doing everything that your quality system tells you to do, you have to report it on your capper, then you have to send a response to the client. And so it just leads to other things. But the fact of the matter is the FDA is getting these reports, and when they eventually come around to investigate you, that's when they'll look at it. Okay. You remember the second badge I showed you. So, like I told you, they knew they had an issue on the lead care too. Okay, and the CEO and the COO were in the position of selling the company when this was all occurring. Okay, and they were going to sell it to a very big company, and basically they told the people stop looking at the things. Okay, and it is what it is. Maybe on the Ultra we can't do anything about it, but bread and butter product, the lead care too, we need to figure out some way to handle this. And that's when they wrote the letter to the file. And what the letter to the file basically was, they changed their labeling, okay, because they made their labeling so that it was less likely that you could get this, false reading. So the CEO and the COO, they sold the company, while this was happening. They're writing emails, to people, don't do this. They actually had it in writing. We need to have plausible deniability, things to that effect. And they sold the company for $66 million, in which, let's see, the CEO got $2 million, the COO got $500,000, and the RA director got nothing. So after they sold the company, then they started submitting more reports to the FDA. And around 2017, the FDA started connecting the dots. Now, I don't know if other people were reporting, I'm sure that was happening, but that's around, so we're going back to 2014, and now it's 3 years later, and that's when the FDA is starting to investigate. Okay. And so during that investigation, that's when they started, getting a story as far as when did you know? They wanted a timeline. And, the problem when you lie, you have to remember your lies. And then, everybody knows why you shouldn't. Okay. Bottom line is that the 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 COO and everybody left. The COO went on to run another company. I think she was Woman of the Year. Okay. The COO went to another state, not escaping or anything, just moving on. And the RA director, she went to another place. Okay. But all this paperwork remained. And then there was also the slight problem. They sold the company. And how does that work? Well, you don't get a mulligan with the FDA. The company that bought the company, even though they didn't do anything wrong, they basically had to settle with the FDA for $28 million. They had to plead to it. Okay. And they had nothing to do with it. Okay. So you do the math. What did I say? 6 million. So, okay, minus that, 28 million. So that's how much the company was sold for. So that's outcome number one. Outcome number two, and that's why, I probably wouldn't put it on the website, because, these people are innocent till proven guilty. And they've been charged. They went and during the pandemic, I guess the investigation slowed down, but up here in the Northeast, when this happened, this was headline news, on the Boston Herald, the Boston Globe. They had their pictures, like, these were evil people. Yeah, even though it's like, okay, let's try to understand the situation. Are they guilty of a crime? Who is really the guilty ones? The boss, or the other person who's told to do something. So I'll leave you with, this is the lessons to be learned. Think strategically. And that's, if you're going to be in this career profession, you always need to be a couple steps ahead of things, whether we do a 510K, you do an audit or whatever, but think strategically. And then what I try to not to do is to judge the mistakes of others. So in other words, it's really simple to say, oh yeah, they're guilty. But when you're working in a company, okay, and things happen, hindsight is 2020. And so I try not to judge the mistakes of others because you never know. You might be put in a situation that's out of your control. So learn from them. Then things may seem black and white, like right now, but there's that gray zone. The ends don't justify the means. Okay. So, if you're involved in a situation, so, well, yeah, I'll lose my job and my house or whatever, you know, that doesn't cut it. And then what I always recommend is be a consultant. It's a safe and great career path because, as consultants, you get an insight of what goes on. When you work for these companies, when I was at Johnson Johnson, it was great because we had so many layers of bureaucracy. It was virtually impossible to, do a crime. And they also told us, we'll be hotter on you than, the FDA. And that was a fact. But when you work for these small companies, sometimes, they're struggling for funds and things like that. And so I just think a consultant in the medical device industry is a safe and great career path. Or work for the FDA. They're good people, and it's a noble profession. I admire what they do, and most of the people I've met at the FDA, they're not mean people, they're not vindictive people. They have the mission to protect the public. So that's all I have. So even though I had that little mess up in the beginning, it didn't set us too far behind. I'll be happy to take any questions if you guys want to know more. You can get the court case. It's on the internet, and it's really, it's about 300 pages. It'll tell you step by step what went on. So, any questions?
Oh, that was great, George.
You like those 1976?
Yeah, seeing the first Rocky, yeah, it was meaningful to me. Most of these people were not even nearly
Yeah,
thought of.
but I just find it amazing, because prior to that, you could do whatever you wanted, medical device wise, and I remember reading a paper from 1976 or 75. And this was in a company I worked with. They actually had it. And it was kind of like, oh, what's this FDA? They're going to start regulating medical devices. And the FDA in the beginning, they didn't have much teeth, okay? Because when the FDA first got the authority to inspect medical devices, it was GMP. It wasn't QSR, it was GMP, good manufacturing practices. And the law was written from the view that all quality problems happen because the American worker is lazy and they're making mistakes, okay? And what the FDA found, and also the FDA had a obligation to inspect factories every 2 years. And so what the FDA found during all the inspections is that the people were trying to do good jobs. They weren't willfully making mistakes. It had to do with, design flaws or flaws in the system. And the FDA didn't have the authority to go into design controls and to go into, you know, other areas of the company management review. And it wasn't until after we had some really disastrous recalls in the 80s and 90s, which would, dealt with hot valves, angioplasty catheters breaking in people's bodies. The FDA received the authority to increase their regulation. In other words, that meant they could inspect design control. And then also that's when it became mandatory to report your problems to the FDA because they'd have these exposés on TV or the front page of the New York Times. They'll say, can you believe that this happened right under the nose of the FDA? And the FDA would look really bad. People would say, well, we're spending all this money. How come we're not getting the results? And so what you're seeing now is the results of all the things that have been learned. Yes, Mary.
Thanks, George. Yeah, there's a couple questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Can you moderate those for me?
Sure. Yeah. So can you speak to what differentiates a normal software bug in the field from a software bug that would require a recall? And what's the process in making that decision?
Oh, that's a tough one. So the FDA requires every company to have a complaint procedure. So when you do the complaint procedure, okay, it's a flow chart. And as you know, these flow charts can be interpreted in different ways. And so technically the FDA, you might fix a software bug and the FDA could look later on and say, that was a recall. Okay. And so I've been in those situations. I worked at a company once. Hopefully, once again, you won't put this, on the internet. But I was told, by the president of the company that you cannot tell the FDA this is a recall. You can get all the product out of the marketplace, but if you inform the FDA that this is a recall, not only would I have been fired, but it wasn't going to happen. And at the time, you didn't have to report recalls to the FDA, so I had some wiggle room. But the FDA inspected us 2 years later, and I remember I was the only one in the conference room. And when the FDA was going through all the complaint files, the FDA looked at me and said, this looks like a recall. And I couldn't say anything. All I had was all my spreadsheets to show that I got all the product out of the, marketplace. We destroyed it and that, communicated to everybody. And basically the FDA, they gave me a mulligan on it. I can't guarantee that'll happen to everybody. So I guess what I'm trying to say to answer your question is that it's not up to us to make the decision if there's a recall. It's usually up to the director of QA, RA for the company, okay? And usually these types of decisions are made, with a consensus, and that consensus could also involve a lawyer. So, if you read the letter of the law, you might be working on something that you would say, geez, I just listened to the guy talk, and this would mean the definition of recall. And what I would say to that is that, well, fixing a problem isn't necessarily a bad thing. Okay. Just like in the situation where, the president of the company said, if you report to the FDA, I'm going to fire you. Okay. And it's like, okay, if he fires me, I know this product that could cause a problem is going to hurt people, and I know how to get all the product. He gave me all the authority to get, all the product out of the marketplace. So I don't know if that helps you, but usually, companies will have a procedure. The problem with software is that we expect bugs to be in software. So in other words, I think the FDA, we kind of have a lower bar with them, okay, where, we could fix something really quick and we could demonstrate that everybody got the patch. And that's where all the cybersecurity stuff is coming up. But I'd say this is that if you fix a bug, okay, and it's to fix a potential safety issue, that would be a recall. But it's not up to you to make that decision. You would simply report it to your supervisor, and then they would make that decision. So I don't know if that helps you, but
yeah, I think what it boils down to is that bug a likely safety risk? And if so, then that requires the health hazard evaluation and more investigation to evaluate the impact and see if it qualifies as a necessary recall in those cases. But
yeah, but if your conscience is bothering you, okay, in other words, you have the law, okay, and the law sometimes is not totally ethical, okay. It's in my opinion, and so I think that when you find yourself in those types of decisions, which are situations, you have to ask yourself, I mean, like how Yujan has it. Would you use this on your mother or whatever? And that's usually how I look at things. And when I've walked away from something, it's because I just can't live with this. You guys can do what you want to do. I'm going to report to the FDA. And this is one of the reasons I'm a consultant. When I first started my career, I started out as an engineer. And that's all I wanted to do was people to leave me alone, just let me be an engineer. But unfortunately, that's not how the world works, you know. And so gradually I got pushed up. And so what I found is that when you're on those high levels, you know, you're a director QA, every day is possible, you know, problem, whether someone wants to use something for off-label use, you know, or if someone is like exaggerating the application of the law, because it can work the other way around. And so at the end of the day, a company is in business to make a profit, and so you know the laws don't recognize that, and so it's not a it's not an easy answer, and I'm sure you know Jim probably could tell me stories or you know you've seen situations like that, and we don't need to go into it, but all I can tell you is that after about the third company I worked for, you know, I just saw a patent, and I remember I said that was when I said, I'm going to be a consultant, you know, and you know, there's
Mhm.
been no regrets because I think it's a great career field. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few, several questions. So the next one is, can companies contest recalls? Have there ever been recalls that are reverted or overturned after a notice has already been made to the public? Or once you get that ball rolling, does it
Once
just
you get that, it takes off. Yeah. And let's see, I've been involved in two official recalls, okay, personally, and then, you know, advising clients on the other one. And once it happens, once you make that call, you know, the saying goes, the die is cast. So that's why, you know, a lot of times companies will bring in the lawyers too. And but you have to be careful there because if you go back to the presentation, there's a story. Can you still see my screen? No.
no?
Okay.
Or
You know,
maybe
on the one with the 1976, there was the Ford Pinto. Okay. And Jim knows about this. The Ford Pinto was a great car. You know, it was America's answer to foreign competition. The only problem is that the gas tank was so close to the trunk that you got in a little rear ender, right? And it was a two-door. Maybe I should share my screen. Let's see, 1 second. Am I sharing? No. Yeah. So you want to read you want to know about recalls like in automotive, check out the Ford Pinto because the company actually made a decision that was cheaper to pay off the wrongful death suits than it was to, you know, do a $20 fix on the car. Okay. And so, you know, we're not the only industry that, you know, has issues.
yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Next question.
Yeah, so what are some things that company can do to prepare for an FDA investigation or avoid or an audit to avoid the risk of being seen as non-compliant?
Sure.
So yeah, the ultimate solution is to have good procedures and follow them, but there are things
Yeah.
that your companies do to specifically prepare for them, like mock investigations or what?
Yeah. 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 So I used to do these too. I do them overseas because I actually have an FDA badge, and you can't have a badge in the United States because that's impersonating the FDA investigator. That's a crime. But for theatrical purposes, you could. So I would get hired, and companies would hire me to go in and to pretend I'm the FDA and hold no punches. Okay. And I would get paid a lot of money to do this, you know, have my flight, nice hotel, and they wanted a report on would they survive an FDA inspection. And sometimes after, like I had one particular inspection I did, okay, and it was for sterilizers. It was for the tabletop autoclaves. And I was doing the inspection, and I discovered that the doors could blow off, okay, because these are under pressure. And everybody in the company knew about it, and they fixed the problem, but they didn't report it to the FDA, and the problem was sitting in their CAPA system, you know. And so during the inspection, I said, we have a problem here, you know, because I was hired to do a good inspection. The guy that hired me was based in the United States. He was upset with me because he said, what are you doing? You know, and I said, I was asked to inspect the place, and I found these problems, and you told me you had no complaints, and they had them over here. And I said, how could that be? Well, needless to say, you know, I finished my report. I let him know what the problem was. Once again, the problem was fixed, but definitely should have been a recall. Someone could have gotten killed, okay? Because the door blew off a couple of times and missed people. So, So yeah, hiring a former FDA investigator is a great thing. You know, there's people out there that do it, that they're retired. Now, my claim to fame was that I've undergone 9 FDA inspections. I think I have the record. And I call it face-to-face inspections, you know, like you're the one in the room. And so that's where I said I bring a unique perspective because I know where the skeletons are hidden. So when I would go and inspect companies doing this, I would know, you know, okay, if you want a good inspection, I'll do it for you, but it may hurt. So what I would say is that there's people out there that will do this. Okay, so there's 2 types of people. There's people that, okay, I'll do it, and you know, I'll give you my report, and then you work on it. You know, professional people, and then there's people that they'll hire. The board of directors will hire, and they'll say, I want to know everything because my name is on it. So yeah, and the FDA also, when they walk into a situation, it's a horror show, okay? What'll happen, especially if it's a big company, they'll issue, it's called a consent decree. And in the consent decree, that's a legal document to the Justice Department. And they'll tell you, you have to hire a third-party consultant. And basically, they don't trust you, you know? And so you're on probation till you get out of it. So, you know, the FDA does recognize and value consultants because we occupy a position of, you know, less conflict of interest. So I see we're coming to the end of the time. You know, we could do this again. I could talk forever. I was thinking of writing a book someday about this, but I'm not sure if anyone would buy it. But anyhow, watch
I'll buy a
everyone.
copy.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Okay, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate this opportunity, and don't change what you're doing in your job. I mean, what I see in analytics, you know, with the leadership and whatever, you know, it's just a great company, a great career path, and so, you know, I'm not trying to scare you or anything. Basically, what I'm trying to do is educate you. So if you ever decide to leave, you work for a company, you need to like, you know, do that due diligence, you know, as far as, am I going to be the, you know, the sacrificial lamb if there's a problem, or am I entering a small company, which I've seen plenty of small companies that have really good systems of checks and balances. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks so much,
Thanks,
George.
George.
Okay,
Thanks, George.
okay, bye now.
Thanks.
Bye.